Good morning, everybody. I'll first outline that overnight we had 7 cases of coronavirus in New South Wales, one of which was acquired overseas and 6 of which are local transmissions, and Dr. Chant will outline further details on that in her report. Can I stress in particular, we remain concerned about potential undetected strains of coronavirus in southwestern and western Sydney. Can I please encourage everybody with the mildest of symptoms or anybody who's been exposed at the venues which health has already identified to make sure they follow the health guidelines, but most importantly, the slightest of symptoms, please make sure you get tested and stay home for 14 days, but also if you're a close contact and health has advised you to get tested and stay home for 14 days, please do that. Whilst the case numbers have pleasingly been declining, my anxiety remains the same, if not slightly higher, because every week we've had an accumulation of undetected or unsourced cases. Health is working overnight 24/7 to find the genomic links or find those links between the cases that don't have a known source and existing clusters. But in the meantime, it means potentially the virus is continuing to spread in particular parts of southwestern and western Sydney. And that is a big concern, because if you look back to Melbourne, Melbourne didn't get worse because of the number of cases they had. They had undetected community transmission, which then unknowingly got to a stage where it did form a number of different clusters, and we certainly don't want that to happen here in New South Wales. And I want to commend everybody, the whole community, everybody for working hard to get us where we are. As I promised on Friday, I want to firstly thank Brett Walker for the very comprehensive report into the Ruby Princess. When I asked him to undertake this piece of work on behalf of the New South Wales Government, I asked him to be direct and frank, leave no stone unturned, and to make sure he felt he'd covered all the issues he needed to cover. And I want to thank him and his team for providing this comprehensive report, which I can confirm I read in full over the weekend. Can I now apologise unreservedly to anybody who suffered as a result of the mistakes that were outlined in the report undertaken by individuals within the health department or the health agency, and I extend that apology unreservedly, in particular to the 62 people who got the virus in secondary or tertiary way, those 62 people who weren't on the ship but somehow contracted the virus as a consequence of that disembarkation. And I want to say I can't imagine what it would be like having a loved one or being someone yourself who continues to suffer and experience trauma as a result. And I want to apologise unreservedly to anybody who is continuing to suffer or has suffered unimaginable loss because of mistakes that were made within our health agencies. Fortunately, Mr. Walker says, and I want to stress, that there weren't systemic issues. He has full confidence in those agencies continuing to work on the pandemic, and I think we can say that since that time we have learned a lot. We have learned so much since those horrible mistakes. And as the Premier, again, I want to apologise to anybody, especially those 62 individuals who got the virus as a secondary or tertiary contact because of the way in which those passengers disembarked the ship, and to anybody who continues to suffer loss and trauma and angst and health concerns as a result of those mistakes. I also want to thank and commend Commissioner Fuller. Mr. Walker acknowledges the work that Commissioner Fuller had already done, which was passed on to Mr. Walker, and Mr. Walker was able to use that information in compiling his report. And again, I say, not only have lessons been learned, but clearly those circumstances should and will never happen again in New South Wales because of the lessons learned, and also because subsequent to those mistakes and subsequent to the way in which that issue was handled, New South Wales prevented, I think, up to 13 or 14 other cruise ships from docking in Sydney. So the lessons were learned very quickly, but unfortunately, in particular for those 62 individuals, the lessons weren't learned soon enough. And again, I apologise unreservedly on behalf of all those individuals and agencies who made those mistakes. In relation to the coronavirus more broadly, last week we did talk about the potential for health to issue clearer guidelines around schools. And I can confirm that at 10 o'clock this morning, and Dr. Chant will mention this, that health did provide some further specific guidelines to remove any ambiguity which may exist on what schools should and should not be doing. And I apologise in advance to parents and school communities if this causes them further restrictions, but it is to maintain ongoing safety, and it is to maintain our ability to have less disruption as possible for parents, children and teachers and principals. And I think all parents who've had to endure months of homeschooling would appreciate our efforts to continue lack of disruption when it comes to face-to-face teaching. And I also wanted to extend in particular my thoughts to Year 11 and 12 students. I have had reports about extra cases of mental health and challenges for people who are sitting the HSC and sitting those final years of schooling, and please know we're doing everything we can to lessen the burden and to support you during this time. I'll now ask Dr. Chant to give her update. I'll ask Minister Hazzard to make some comments, Commissioner Fuller to make some comments, but also to provide an update on the compliance regime to date. And again, I want to commend police, because from day one we knew we'd only be able to manage this pandemic with police front and centre of our ability to manage the logistics, compliance, even to the extent of ensuring that PPE we received was able to be received because of their supreme logistical capacities through the New South Wales Police Force. And I remain extremely grateful for their efforts and commend them for their actions to date. I'll now ask Dr. Chant to make some comments.
Thank you, Premier. Before I begin my report, can I also echo the words of the Premier? I would like to express my apologies for the impact of the mistakes on the health and wellbeing of the community. We have seen 7 new cases of COVID were diagnosed in the 24 hours to 8 p.m. last night, bringing the total number of cases to 3,768. There were 10,806 tests reported in the 24-hour reporting period. Of the 7 new cases reported to 8 p.m. last night, 6 were locally acquired and 1 was a traveller in hotel quarantine. 3 of the locally acquired cases are close contacts of cases linked to the Chopsticks Asian cuisine at Smithfield RSL. 2 are close contacts of a case linked to Our Lady of Mercy College, whose source is still under investigation. 1 case that I've just referenced attended the Sydney Girls High School at Surrey Hills whilst infectious on the 6th, 7th, 10th and 11th of August, and the school is closed for cleaning and will reopen on Tuesday the 18th of August, and contact tracing is underway. Another case worked at the Parramatta Local Court, and the person last attended the Parramatta Local Court on Wednesday the 12th of August, and the positive result was received on Saturday the 15th of August. As a precaution, cleaning of the courthouse took place on Sunday the 16th of August, and all close contacts have been identified and are being contacted. Some of the information that we've received recently is that people are tending to think that their illness is influenza. They're saying, oh, it's okay, I've got flu-like symptoms, I must have influenza, I don't need a COVID test. It is essential. At the moment, we have very low rates of influenza circulating. So if you have symptoms, respiratory symptoms of cough, fever, sore throat, runny nose, headache, aches and pains, it is most likely that you have COVID, not flu. And so it is essential that people don't just think, oh, it's influenza or it's another respiratory virus, and come forward to testing. As the Premier indicated, we are concerned that there are low levels of transmission still occurring, particularly in areas of Western Sydney and Southwestern Sydney. It is essential that anyone with symptoms, particularly in those areas, come forward for testing to allow us to stop any further transmission. Every day we are identifying 1 or 2 cases of unknown source cases. Also reflecting on the Premier's comments, I have written to education, and that is across the government and non-government schools, to provide updated advice about and clarification into terms of those activities that need to cease for the next 6 weeks. We will reassess this advice in light of where we are in terms of the COVID pandemic at the end of term 3. I would also like to echo my appreciation for the engagement with the non-government and Catholic school sector and also our education sector in adopting these measures. So in summary, they relate to preventing or minimising any mixing of students from schools in different regions, and that may occur as related to sporting related activities, but other activities in schools. We're having a particular focus on stopping singing or chanting activities or the use of wind instruments in groups, and that is because we have increasingly become aware around the way that droplets and aerosols can be generated by those activities. Also, school-related social activities, school formals, dinners and dances and graduation ceremonies or parent engagement functions should cease. And also school-related overnight events such as retreats, camps, excursions, as there is obviously an increased risk of transmission in these residential type exposures that are a consequence of those activities. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Gary. I'd also like to thank Brett Walker for his very detailed report. I'm also sorry that people's lives have been impacted by decisions in this 100-year pandemic. There were learnings, obviously immediately, from the circumstances, which, as the Premier's highlighted, led to another 14, I think it was, ships not being allowed to come into Sydney. And I also want to stress that in this 100-year pandemic, there are learnings every day by New South Wales Health, and those learnings have continued to enable us to get to where we've got today, which obviously in terms of the pandemic is a positive position. Having said that, I do ask the community to listen to the words of Dr. Chant and New South Wales Health, and certainly to work with us to make sure that we can try and achieve an even better outcome for the entire community.
Good morning. Thanks, Premier. New South Wales Police is still driving a heavy compliance operation with COVID-19, particularly in relation to the health orders. Since the operation commenced, we've conducted nearly 90,000 either business inspections or home isolation inspections. Over recent weeks, the number of tickets issued has increased to about 120. And whilst that's a low number, against the population of New South Wales, we know how devastating the virus can be when one person goes into a built-up area. So we will continue to drive enforcement, and we'll continue to breach those who break the health orders. So again, we would ask businesses as you open to make sure that you conduct your business within the health orders, having COVID marshals if need be, but particularly licensed premises, restaurants and cafeterias. It's very important that you continue to respect the health orders. So from our perspective, we will continue to enforce that, and I envisage over the coming weeks that we'll continue to write tickets for those that are flouting the laws. We've had around 20,000 people ring Crime Stoppers and report people breaching the health orders, which I think speaks volumes that the community are on board with just how dangerous COVID-19 is, and they're supportive of the security aspect of this operation. The border operation will continue between Victoria and New South Wales, and of course the hotel operation continues with nearly 47,000 people now who have either returned to international airports and or from those flying in from Victoria. So it still is a huge police operation with close partnerships with other government agencies like Health and Australian Defence Force, and obviously we are planning to continue that throughout the course of 2020. Thank you.
Commissioner, while you're there, could you give us an update on your investigation of the Ruby Princess?
Yeah, Strike Force Barrett continues. There are still 13 police working full time in relation to that, collecting evidence. Obviously the Special Commission of Inquiry report is important, but what is also important is the evidence that sits behind that. The roles of the Special Commission Inquiry and the criminal investigation are different. So from our perspective, that we will continue to look at anyone who had, I suppose, a role or responsibility in the Ruby Princess.
Do you expect any arrests?
Look, when I spoke about the criminal investigation earlier, I said I wasn't going to put a timeline on it. That's why the Special Commission of Inquiry was established, to get to the bottom of some answers early, and that was done. But the criminal investigation needs to take time. There are tens of thousands of documents that have been sourced. There are surveys and interviews. I think there's 1,200 people so far that have been given statements in relation to it. So it is an enormous investigation. I can't put a time frame on it.
Is it necessary to continue the investigation, though, given what Brett Walker has found, which is that there were mistakes made, but he hasn't said that there's any criminal recourse?
I think you need to respect that the questions that were asked of the Special Commission of Inquiry are certainly different to one when you're investigating criminal negligence. I think also that the Special Commission of Inquiry had to move a mountain in a very short amount of time, and I think they did an outstanding job with that. But in terms of the criminal investigation, I think it needs to run its course, and we need to take time, if we need to interview every person who was on that ship.
Is your investigation looking at the breach of the health orders from New South Wales Health in not requiring people who came off that ship to go into 14 days isolation, finding from Brett Walker? Are you investigating that, and do you expect that there might be fines associated with not complying with the health order?
Look, from our perspective, we will take the recommendations and obviously we'll look at those carefully. We'll look at the evidence behind them carefully. It's important to note that evidence that is adjudicated from special commissions of inquiry and royal commissions is not automatically able to be used in criminal investigations, so it's not without complications, but nevertheless, if there's evidence that sits behind those recommendations that can assist New South Wales Police, then we will attempt to get that information.
Commissioner, while I've got you, if I may ask you in relation to the Blakehurst crash, why was that off-duty police officer who was involved in that crash given a court attendance notice when he crossed lanes, crashed into 6 cars and injured people? Wouldn't a person normally be charged with negligent driving in those circumstances, and was he given special because he's a police officer?
Look, I'm happy to review that matter. Obviously, that these are all oversighted by the court, and there will be a complaint in relation to that matter. So I'm happy to have a look at that matter and come back to you. But I would certainly be disappointed if he was given special treatment. But happy to look at it.
What is your general reaction to that? I mean, you've got an off-duty police officer, twice the legal limit.
He should be treated like the community. And the reality is, whenever police break the law, they are treated at a higher standard. In the fact, they often lose their jobs. And you think about most people in the community who break the law rarely lose their employment. So these matters are treated carefully.
Has he been in that position long?
I'll have to have a look into that matter. I'll come back to you if that's okay.
Premier, in regards to the Ruby Commission in findings, what's your reaction to the fact that New South Wales Health failed to comply with a health order that the Minister had signed into law 2 days prior in regards to making sure people went into 2 weeks quarantine after entering New South Wales from overseas?
Look, Brett Walker is very clear in relation to the mistakes that were made, and is very clear on the recommendations he's put forward to government. And I should state, which I neglected to at the outset of my comments, that the New South Wales Government will of course implement all of the recommendations. A few of the recommendations also relate to our interaction with federal agencies, and of course we will work with federal agencies to put those or strengthen those protocols. And I also want to state that I asked the head of the Health Department to ensure that she is responsible for ensuring the recommendations are adopted as soon as possible.
Would disciplinary action against any of the members of the expert panel be appropriate?
Well, Mr. Walker doesn't make that recommendation. Can I say, and this is why I've expressed my deepest apology in every which way I can. Our role now, my role as the Premier, is to deal with this pandemic, and we need to ensure we have continuity in all the roles people have. Mr. Walker acknowledged there were no systemic issues, but there were mistakes by individuals at a particular time. I know that lessons have been learned. I know that many people are suffering as a consequence of what they perhaps perceived they should have done and didn't do. And what I have to think about in my role as the Premier is how can we get through this pandemic in the best way possible. And in that way, my decision is to ensure that we have continuity of people who are conducting those expert roles and make sure that the lessons are learned and to make sure that all the recommendations are accepted, but also to give comfort to the community that we will also work with those federal agencies Mr Walker identified in relation to establishing those protocols. This is something none of us expected to deal with ever. Forget the pandemic, but border protection isn't something the states traditionally look after. And whilst I don't want to take away from the mistakes that were made, but many people were thrown into situations they hadn't experienced before, and I'm not excusing the mistakes made, because clearly some people should have acted differently, and that was outlined in the report.
Talk about the lessons learned. What's top of mind, or what's the most important lessons that have to be learned from this?
Well, as Mr Walker said, the strongest lesson to be learned, I think, is the risk assessment. You know, the risk assessment should have been a higher risk than the classification, and then that would have ensured different protocols. And Mr Walker is very clear on, without going into too much detail, but he's very clear on what the monumental mistakes were in his view. And certainly he also expressed the view that they were isolated to this incident and one-off mistakes. Had he said they were systemic issues, I would have dealt with that immediately. But he goes to some length to say that he has confidence in the people involved and that these were not systemic issues. Had he said that, I would have taken action. But that's why I also made the effort to read the report cover to cover to make sure that I was satisfied that I didn't have to do anything beyond what I've said today.
Premier, on that, the Prime Minister had said that the Commonwealth would fully cooperate with that inquiry. They refused the summons by Brett Walker for the member from the Department of Agriculture. Do you feel that the federal government did everything they could, given that Mr Walker described them as the fly in the ointment when it came to that commission?
Well, I can only comment on what comes within the responsibility of state government, and I want to limit my comments to that. The only comments I'll make in relation to federal agencies is at least 2 or 3 of the 5 recommendations do relate to protocols being amended and established between federal and state agencies, and we'll make sure that occurs. But I don't want to get into that argument.
Premier, Justin Clancy is now asking for you to scrap the Victorian border policy. What's your response to the proposal to put a ring around Albury? And you're sending in the Deputy Premier this week. Does that mean you're open to change?
Look, we want to, of course, make sure that our border communities go through as least angst and disruption as possible, but we also have to be aware that the level of community transmission in country Victoria is not readily known. So we don't have confidence that the rate of transmission in Victoria, in regional Victoria in particular, is under control to the extent that we would like. And so I certainly put it this way, I'm not suggesting that we'll continue the trajectory of having fewer cases, but to get from the first transmission we had from a known Victorian source to where we are today has taken us 6 weeks, and that's just from one case. And we still are worried because there could be still unknown sources in the community. I can't stress enough how virulent the disease is, how difficult it is to control, and how much effort goes on behind the scenes. And I know it's a joint effort with community and police, but these health detectives 24/7 are literally trying to look under every nook and cranny to stop the spread. And I put that in context because I know our border communities are suffering, but please know that I am in contact with the Victorian Premier. He raised a few issues with me, as did the Prime Minister, and we're working through those issues. But I would rather have the blame for being too harsh than too soft and allowing the disease to get in. The last thing we want is for the disease to get into regional New South Wales. That won't help anybody. But having said that, if there are safe ways in which we can do things, of course we will. But I will take the health advice on that. If there's a safer way to give people more freedom, we will do that. But please also know that people south of our border coming into New South Wales have more freedom than they do in Victoria because they're at stage 3 in regional Victoria. So clearly we appreciate those issues. And we also appreciate that there are always exceptions whenever there's a border closure. You have to allow those essential services and workers to come across. You have to allow those with humanitarian and exceptional circumstances. And that in itself is a huge piece of work, because it does mean that health and police have to be involved in that activity. I would like to see health's 100% focused on contact tracing, but because of all these other compliance and exemptions, it does put pressure on our resources to be able to do that. So wherever we can, we try and be as black and white as possible in relation to the borders. Once you start going into grey, it becomes very difficult to monitor and have compliance. So it is a balancing act, and a difficult balancing act. But if there are opportunities for us to ease the pressure on our communities, especially in Albury, and I'm in constant contact with Mr Clancy, and I want to thank him for being a strong advocate for his community. I want to thank him for contacting me frequently and regularly on the challenges his community is facing, and we are working very hard to try and ease the pressure and stress on his community.
Can I ask the health minister? Chair Ross, sorry. We've been alerted to a privacy breach involving New South Wales Health where the quarantines exemption unit sent a member of the public an email thread that contains somebody else's permit application, including their personal details. As the Minister in charge, what's your response to this, and can the public be confident that their personal information is secure?
I'm sorry, I don't know anything about that particular matter, but I'll immediately ask to have a close look at it. I would say this, that New South Wales Health and Customer Service have been working really hard to get permits out to people, and of course that's a critical part of, as the Premier just said, making sure that our system is viable, that is keeping New South Wales residents safe, but also allowing those humanitarian and critical workers to work. So I'll have a look at it, but I can't give you that answer now. Sorry.
Just in regards to what I asked the Premier in regards to disciplinary action, is one of the crucial reasons that nobody should go, so to speak, is because there are members of that panel who've done very well with contact tracing, for instance?
The Commissioner made it very clear that there were no systemic issues, and he also made it very clear that he wasn't recommending disciplinary action. I think we have to have faith in Commissioner Walker's views.
Minister,
Do you have faith?
Sorry, can I come back to you, James?
Do you have
Ashley.
faith? There was human error. Do you have faith, or should the public have faith in that health officials are not going to make any mistakes, with everything to do with this pandemic?
Look, I think it's fair to say that it's a 1 in 100 year pandemic, and the health staff are trying really hard to do everything possible to keep people safe. If you look at what's happening in other parts of the world, if you look at what's happening in Victoria, then clearly New South Wales health staff are doing a very, very significant job to keep us safe. And that's all I can really say on that note. James?
why did your department allow onward travel from passengers from the Ruby Princess to where they lived, despite you signing into effect a health order that said they should have been in quarantine for 2 weeks? And do you take responsibility for not complying with your health order?
James, you're actually not right on that. The quarantine wasn't quarantine. It was self-isolation, and if you have a close look at Brett Walker's report, you'll see that he makes reference to the fact that they were advised on self-isolation.
You found that the actions did not comply with the health order that you signed into effect on 17th.
Well, I've answered the question. Yeah, sorry.
Just on the Queensland border, we've been hearing reports that there might be some difficulties staffing the Tweed hospitals because of staff coming across the border from the Queensland side.
Yeah.
Are you struggling to staff the Tweed and Northern Rivers hospitals?
The Northern Area Health Service has been working very hard to try and get additional staff to make sure that the Tweed Hospital and the others, Lismore and so on in that northern area, are fully staffed. I've also raised the issue with the Queensland Health Minister, who is being as helpful as he can be within the confines of what the current orders are, and we'll continue to try and make sure that all of our people in New South Wales are getting the appropriate support. Having said that, there's also, as the Premier's pointed out, exemptions, and if there are particular cases that require it, then I will be personally talking, as I regularly do, to Minister Miles.
We've heard that there is a baby who was born on the North Coast who has health problems, so was flown to Brisbane, and now the mother is stuck and can't get up there.
Actually, I only heard about that last night when I was watching the news. No one's brought that one to my attention, but if I were not here, I would have actually made a phone call to Stephen Miles to find out what we can do, and I will do that as soon as this is all over.
Dr. Chan, could we just clarify some of the schools issues? So in regards to what you said about school sport, is it a case that inter-school sporting competitions now need to be called off?
So what we're talking about is schools that outside the geographical area. So at the moment, the principle we're trying to achieve is not have, for instance, teams from one region of Sydney playing another region of Sydney, and the same will apply to community sport. So at this moment, we are trying to limit the movements of people across our regions from around our metropolitan areas, plus also prevent inter-competitions that might involve our country cousins coming down to Sydney. So this is the idea we're trying to achieve, is just reduce the risk of seeding events into rural regional or seeding across areas of New South Wales. Some of the other recommendations pick up on some of the transmission modes that we've encountered. We're still observing that in some settings more than the required numbers of parents are attending some of the events. So the smaller the size of events, the less risk you've got COVID introduced and the less risk you have of potentially initiating further spread. So what the advice does is reflect on some of the cases we've seen recently, and it also is done with the spirit of trying to make sure that our schools can maintain their on-site learning. So I do want to acknowledge the swift and prompt response when we do have a case, and that works seamlessly, but our aim would be to not even have that impact on schools by keeping it out of the school environment.
Jan, how do you keep year groups apart within a school itself? How do you keep the year ones from being near the year threes in the playground?
We're less concerned with the younger age groups, but clearly there is ability to make sure that your year 10s and year 11s and year 12s are not mixing. Also, some of the recommendations go to more around school sporting competitions which might be across those regions. So we know that, for instance, some of our cases have actually travelled from the regions into Sydney, and in one case that's where we believe that the person acquired it. So in order to prevent that seeding of our regional areas, we would suggest that those, or require or recommend that those sorts of activities do not continue at this current time for the next 6 weeks. And the whole purpose of this is to actually get down to no community transmission. We know this virus is very challenging, and what we've learned is even having very, very low levels of grumbling transmission mean that you only then need one transmission event, which is non-recognised, to set up that chain. And I think that you can see that from some of the information we've presented. If we go back and look at the Crossroads cluster, that Crossroads cluster spawned many, many other cases in a chain. It wasn't actually the direct transmission on that time, but there were subsequent cases. And if we hadn't recognised that cluster, many of those individuals, like members of the community now who are not presenting for testing, wouldn't have been recognised. They would have then passed it on to their loved ones, and we would have set up basically community transmission in Sydney, and then potentially seeded metropolitan rural areas. And it basically mirrors what's occurring in Victoria, and we have to heed those lessons.
Part of the problem with Tangara, though, was that they're only recommendations. They're not under the public health orders, so the schools aren't breaching, it's not illegal if they do hold, say, a camp or a wind instrument choir. Will this be written into law, so therefore these schools are forced to do this or not?
I'm very pleased that last week we spent a lot of time discussing some of the learnings. I think going into term 3, we've had a number of cases in schools, and from that we have reflected the learnings. And some of the learnings is, again, to reinforce those very basics about making sure that sick children are not sent to school, make sure that schools have very robust processes, that they exclude anyone that has got symptoms compatible with COVID until they have a negative test. And some of that basic social distancing and hand hygiene that we need to enforce as base level protections in our schools. What we've then identified is that some other activities have posed increased risk, and that's the basis of the advice we've provided. In engagement with the non-government sector and education, I'm very confident that the schools will embrace this. In fact, they've actually asked for very clear guidance and clear, strong language of what we think is appropriate and not. We've issued that guidance, and I believe that the sectors will implement those recommendations. If they don't, then obviously we, with the Minister's approval, we have other powers to do public health orders. But we have achieved many things by people just applying good common sense and working cooperatively. I've also written again to churches and community leaders who play such a pivotal part at the moment, and again reminding them of some of the learnings that we've had from our recent clusters associated with places of worship. Again, as the Minister said, this is a time where we're continuing to learn, and it's important that we share those learnings about how COVID has been transmitted.
Do you think that you overstated the message that schools are safe?
No, I think the evidence supports the fact that online learning, that face-to-face learning is the optimum. I think that would be what our education colleagues would reinforce, and I think parents would probably share that view. We've always said that children can catch COVID, so I've always been very careful that they are safe environments, but they are not necessarily free of COVID. We have done all we can to make them as safe as possible, but we do know that particularly younger children tend to have very mild disease and also don't transmit. What we recognise, and that's been increasingly recognised, is that the older children, particularly as they get around the ages of year 11 and 12, tend to behave more as adults, young adults, in terms of their risk of transmission. But having said that, they're also of an age where they can comply with social distancing. They're not as mobile, they can comply, and therefore we think that schools will put in place a different set of strategies for that cohort.
What's the serology testing showing you about total community exposure?
So we have, there is a process that we had taken some serology, and the purpose of that is to understand how many people were infected with COVID in Sydney at a point in time, and then the idea is that you'll take that samples again at another time to see your transmission rate. What that is yet to be reported, and we'll obviously share it with you once it is, but suffice it to say, the preliminary data suggests that the phase of the wave one of the pandemic was actually quite low levels of community exposure at that time. I don't want to speculate because, like all scientists, they'll put lots of confidence intervals around it, caveats around it. And remember, the sampling we did reflects Sydney, and at that time Sydney was the most impacted, and we had basically very much sparing of our regional community. So that has to be taken into account. I would prefer that the article is published in the scientific way with the appropriate caveats and interpretation around it.
Last question,
Just in terms of, you said your goal is to get community transmission down to zero. The Queensland Premier said today that we won't open the border. She won't open the border until it is zero. How long do you think, with the tracking of the way it's going, how long do you think that it will be until we are down to zero, if things continue as they have been?
I think that's a really difficult question, and I don't think I can give a straightforward answer, unfortunately. I think that we are, as we've been saying, on a knife's edge, and it's pleasing to see that some of our data is showing that the community's behaviours are changing. It's pleasing to see a number of you wearing masks, and the data suggests that on our public transport and when people are in supermarkets and shopping centres, the proportion of people wearing masks increased. I think people have increased their awareness around social distancing, and there have been changes in sort of non-essential gatherings. So my answer will be, if we are able to, I suppose if I'm an optimist, if everyone works together, I think it is achievable. But it really is going to require an incredible community response, an incredible business response. But ultimately, we have a choice. And for me, as a health official, having no community transmission is desirable from minimising the impact on the community, because having low levels of grumbling transmission of this virus just poses so much risk. You just got to get it.
That's an eradication strategy.
No, it's not. It's not an eradication strategy, and I think that's really very important that we understand that it is. Well, what it is different is that we always have to recognise that we cannot go back to normal. So until we have a vaccine, or an effective treatment, we can never go back to normal. I think the information or the emergence of the disease in New Zealand highlights that case in point. So whilst ever COVID is in this world, and we don't have an effective vaccine or an effective treatment, we have to be COVID aware. Our lives have to change. We have to maintain our social distancing. We have to maintain our border measures. We have to understand how we can prevent reintroductions. But we can never be complacent about COVID, and that's the difference between elimination versus what I'm saying is the ideal goal, which will be no community transmission.
Doctor, just
Last
in
question, please.
regards to Ruby, Doctor, your staff members who made the serious errors, how are they now doing? Because they're fairly crucial for us going forward, like mentally and psychologically.
So all of the staff involved presented and gave evidence, and I think, frankly, to the Commission, and actually identified that in hindsight they would have made a different decision. A number of them, obviously, no one wants to make this sort of error of judgment, and so, but those practitioners at that time were under immense stress. I think it's easy to talk about the numbers we've got now, but at that time we were dealing with significant case numbers, a large number of locally acquired cases. There were outbreaks in a number of settings. It was a very, very busy time. And as Commissioner Walker says, that cannot excuse or I don't provide that as to provide an excuse for the actions, but I think it is important that we understand the context at the time. So I am, my thoughts are with the public health officials as they are with the community, and it has had a toll on those individuals.
Minister, can I ask you a final question on this issue? Do you take ministerial responsibility for the mistakes that were made in the saga involving the Ruby Princess, which you say not just benefits? Do you take responsibility for that, including not complying with your own health?
I just corrected you, James, and I'll correct you again, that your interpretation of the health orders is not correct. And as to your second question, I'll rely on Brett Walker's commentary in his report.